Speaker.
John O'Nolan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I apologise if somewhere along the line my voice fades during this speech. It could well be a blessing. In fact, I'm sure the honourable member opposite would just love it if I would wallow down and sort of sink into the seat. But I'll keep going as I can anyway. I'll do my best, and hopefully that will be good enough for her. Mr. Speaker, it is a novel day as I find myself in agreement with New Zealand First, or at least one of its members, in this bill that's going forward. I think in my 6 months in Parliament, it's sort of, I'm just being told to be careful of my colleagues. In normal circumstances, it may well be a career-threatening mood to agree with Tracy Martin, but today I think when we look at the content of this amendment bill, it is clear that it is the right course of action for us to take to support this bill. This morning, while we were in the middle of the review of the Social Workers Registration Board at the Social Services Select Committee, I received a out-of-the-blue text message from my daughter who asked me what years it was that I worked for Child, Youth and Family. I thought it was a somewhat unusual text to get from one's 21-year-old daughter, and so I replied back to her and said it was in 1997 and 1998, which is a good few years ago now. She did enlighten me. The reason she was telling me that was that she'd was applying for a job with them on a part-time basis, and thought she might have to disclose that at some point. Anyway, I digress slightly, yes. But it did cause me to reflect. In fact, some might even say more than slightly, but there is method to my madness, because it caused me to reflect on my time as a child, youth and family social worker. It was a brief stint. I think at the time the average length of service for social workers was about 10 months, and I managed 7. But during that time, Mr. Speaker, these issues that we're discussing today certainly came to light. I remember on many occasions one of the issues that we were asked to do at times was to speak to caregivers who were caring for children who were at that stage under the care of the state, to see whether or not they would be prepared to take on additional guardianship, and then they would move to receiving the unsupported child benefit rather than care payments. There were good social work reasons for doing this. For some people, they had a child in their care for a very long period of time, and a significant bond had formed, and it was clear that the child would in fact really be better served by remaining with this family over a long period of time. Their need for social work input was minimal, and in fact we used to find with a lot of those children we would do our sort of mandatory visit just to make sure that we could tick the right box in the KPI column, because actually there was no need for ongoing social work intervention because the placement was stable, the bond was good. But as a social worker turning up to those families and putting that to them, would they consider taking on additional guardianship? And for the Ministry of Social Development, or I can't remember quite what it was we were called back in 1997 or 98, I think we were the Child, Youth, Families and Young Persons Service or something, no, Children, Young People, anyway, the SIFs in those days. We had a little P in the middle of the SIFs. Well, you know, when you've got to go, you've got to go. But anyway, anyways, clearly, again behind me I'm hearing, is there a doctor in the house? Anyway, whatever it was that we were called, we would have to go and talk to these families, but it was actually a pretty hard call to actually go and say, look, it's fantastic the work you've done with this young person. You've taken them from a place of brokenness to a place of wholeness, to a place of belonging, but by the way, we'd like you to get paid a whole lot less than you are now. And it seems sort of, it was I guess an unpleasant thing to have to go and do. It was, as I say, good social work practice actually to say the time has come for us to pull out. The time is for us, for you to make it on your own. But to actually then say we want you to do this and receive less money didn't make a lot of sense. And so I guess this amendment that we're putting through now, which will allow people in those situations to receive the same sorts of payment to support these children, I think is incredibly good. And the previous speaker alluded to some of the importance of that, because I think it's really important for young people and children when they are in care. There's enough stigma at times associated with that as it is. And so we want to make sure that in the very least there's adequate funding coming through to ensure that they're not having to go and buy clothes from the second-hand store, that we can make sure that there is the opportunity for them to be able to participate as children who perhaps with their own families do in society. And so I think it's really important that we have payments like this to ensure that their dignity is maintained. And so, Mr. Speaker, I've referred to those people who are perhaps have been foster carers who move into a more permanent arrangement with additional guardianship and receiving the unsupported child benefit. But of course, not everybody who is a kin carer who has had that benefit or had the process of having been a foster carer first. Sometimes they simply, for all manner of reasons, wind up having young people in their care which they had not planned on doing. And almost inevitably it's not occurred because of some sort of pre-planned idea that that's how it would be. It's not because when they set out in life they thought, oh, at approximately this point in my life it would be great to take on some children to care. No, Mr. Speaker, it will often occur as a result of some form of tragedy, whether it be through the sudden death or loss of parents, or through abuse and neglect and children no longer being able to be with their parents, and they find themselves being cared for by extended family members, often grandparents in fact, who perhaps are at a stage of life where they weren't really necessarily planning on doing this, and it becomes a very stressful environment. It's stressful enough, I guess, being a parent at times as it is, but and so therefore I'm coming to that. If you just hang on, we've got 10 minutes to walk our way through this and we'll get to it. 3 minutes, all right. Well, I mean, I was talking in terms of the whole length of the speech, not what was left, but thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now know I've got 3 minutes left and I'll make sure I get to that point that the Honourable Annette King, and I think I got the full name right, so that's good. So anyway, what I was saying was that there is stress involved, and so it's appropriate that there are financial payments made to ensure that that stress is decreased, so that people, when through whatever circumstances they find themselves caring for these young people, that they are having that burden lessened somewhat. And at the very least, I think what we can expect is that they would find themselves receiving the same level of compensation, thank you, Mr. Speaker, the same level of compensation as if they had been foster caregivers in terms of being able to provide for the material needs of those children. Now, I know that the Honourable Member over the other side of the room was said, why do we have to wait so long? And Mr. Speaker, there is a rationale for that. And I understand that in the report that came back from the Select Committee, that was outlined pretty clearly that actually there are some transitional arrangements in place that have been set up already, and the government has through the annual school and year start-up payment for carers, believe that in the first instance that may well be enough. But Mr. Speaker, we do recognise that over time the issue of parity for people to be able to receive appropriate levels of compensation to ensure that young people are being cared for appropriately, to ensure that young people who are in the care of not necessarily their legal parents but in the care of others who have stepped up to the plate in difficult situations, Mr. Speaker, will be able to provide for those children. And so, as I said at the beginning of my speech, I find myself agreeing with Tracy Martin on this occasion. It may well not be the last time. It may well happen again in the future. But we'll have to wait and see if, in fact, that can happen. It's been, I think, overall, from my understanding, while this went through the Select Committee process before my time, Mr Speaker, I understand it was a very constructive process. I understand that it was a good conversation that was had between the member who brought this bill forward and the government, and I look forward, Mr Speaker, to seeing this passage of this bill continue through the House and for this situation to be resolved. Thank you.
Well done. Catherine